Hello, everyone. I'm Shahzeb Usman, and we welcome you to our conversation. Today, we will be discussing a critical view of international law in relation to Gaza crisis. We are happy to have Mr. Ammar Kazmi, who is a British lawyer and a political campaigner. He has law degrees in English and Spanish law, and he also holds an LLM in human rights law. He has worked in the British Parliament and has also worked with former British Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn. At the moment, he is helping to run a small fundraising organization which connects activists and protesters with legal support. Hello, Hamar. How are you?
Hello, Shahzeb. I'm very well, thank you. And may I just say that it's a real pleasure to be able to join you at the Islamabad Policy Research Institute, and I thank you very much for your invitation.
Thank you very much for coming, Amar. It's a pleasure to host you here. Amar, everybody is looking at the Gaza crisis, and we are seeing that in Gaza crisis, there's a lot of crimes against humanity being committed. There's also war crimes being committed. So, how do you think that international law seems to be very powerless in the face of these atrocities? And, if you can outline some of the critical theories about international law in terms of its enforcement, because international law as a whole seems to lose its efficacy, some people believe. So, can you tell us something about why it seems like that and what is the critical perspective in relation to that?
Certainly, I mean, international law is very often unenforceable because of the way in which international law is designed and operates. And if you compare it to, a traditional legal system within a state, the state is able to enforce law because it's a central authority. It has police forces, it has a military, it has a system of courts, and so on. And it's then able to compel the enforcement of law. Whereas the international system, um, there's no real central authority within it. There's no guarantor authority. So whilst you have international treaties and legal custom and even international courts, the element of compulsion is missing. Now, some people might look at the United Nations, which of course is made up of 193 member states, or the UN Security Council in particular, and think that this is a body that's able to enforce international law, and theoretically within the UN Charter, that is supposed to be the job of the Security Council. It's supposed to establish and maintain international peace and security. It's supposed to take measures against acts of aggression and so on. But there are 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and any one of them can use their veto power to block resolutions that might be supported by all the other members of the Security Council. The United States, for example, regularly uses its veto power to protect the state of Israel. So the political interests of a world superpower can, and they of course do, supersede the interests of the rest of the world, or much of the rest of the world. And that means that international law can't be enforced in many cases. So first, there's the issue in the very structure of international law. The international legal system, to a great degree, is a product of the Second World War, because it was the victors of that war who planned between themselves how they were going to, design the new international order once they had won the war. And actually, that included things like having permanent members of the UN Security Council. And second, there's the issue about power. At the end of the day, there's no global police force, there's no global military. The power of international courts like the ICJ and the ICC is very limited. And in that situation, the only way to ensure compliance with international law is to leverage power. And that can come from various sources. Non-state military actors may be able to exert power through a military campaign, or social movements and human rights organizations can bring a certain amount of pressure to bear. But generally, it's nation states that have the most power here, and they can come together to exert pressure if they want to, through sanctions, through international isolation, through various different mechanisms that they have at their disposal. And as we've seen, all across the world, populations have been taking to the streets to demand that their governments do something with what's happening in Gaza, whether that's withdrawing their ambassadors, whether it's putting sanctions into effect, and so on. Because the United Nations, which is, I would say, an international body par excellence. I mean, it is the international forum of the world. Literally can't compel anything to happen, and that's largely because the United States, which is the world's foremost military and economic power, at this moment is absolutely determined to shield Israel from any kind of criticism or any kind of enforcement of international law.
Very interesting. I think this seems to be at odds with the liberal order of, international law when we say that international law is consent-based, rule-based international order. This whole idea that you said that it's all about power, it's nothing to do with a rules-based order. I think again, this goes against the conventional contemporary discourse, and I think that's very interesting because again, a lot of people, that is the main criticism of international law, that it is not enforceable. There's nobody to have enough power to enforce it. So, why do you think, from a critical perspective, could you explain a bit more about why the leveraging of power is so important? Because, simply by respecting international law, we cannot ensure it's enforceable. So, why do you think that power is so important, leveraging it so important?
Yes, and I think just before I get into the power thing, I should just quickly come back to the issue of, the critical perspective, and that will inform what I mean when I'm talking about, leveraging power. So when I'm talking about the critical perspective, and when we're analyzing international law from a critical perspective, we're combining scholarly views that have come out of the third world approaches to international law school of thought, which is very often referred to as TWAIL. There's also been some very interesting Marxist critical analysis of international law. I know that some people get scared when they hear the word Marxism, but we're not talking about, in this context, communism or anything. We're talking about a materialist form of analysis, and what that does is it seeks to concentrate on looking at real life, looking at the real life economic and political relationships that influence absolutely everything that comes behind these legal frameworks, and it tries to uncover those economic and political relationships. And of course, there are other approaches. There's a realist approach to international law. But all of these are very different to the liberal way of thinking, which you were kind of referring to. Because in the liberal framework, everything is based in ideals. It's about, what should be the case or what ought to be the case. Whereas I think it's more appropriate to look at what is the case in reality. There's not much point, in my view, of simply restating international humanitarian law and saying, for example, here is the law, Israel, you need to follow it, or whichever country, you need to follow that law. It's more helpful to understand why Israel has the power to ignore it, and look at realistic ways that it could be, forced to comply with it. So if we start from a materialist analysis, we could take the idea, for example, that there is, I don't know, a sovereign equality of states. Okay, but that's only a formal type of equality. So yes, legally, states are equal, but we know that all states are unequal in terms of their significance, in terms of their power, and that was something that was highlighted by Evgeny Pashukhanis, who was a Soviet legal scholar, and something that Pashukhanis highlighted, and he wrote this in 1924, so almost about a century ago, was that less powerful states become the objects of imperialist states' colonial policy. And so what that means is, in simple terms, is powerful states are not only able to control other states, but because of their power, they can act illegally, they can avoid international legal requirements. And because we have this indeterminacy in international law, because powerful states can often do what they want, there's no coercive mechanism to hold them to account, then people have to rely on something called self-help, which is self-explanatory. They have to take up arms, or they have to engage in some other kinds of retaliatory measures. They have to find a way to help themselves because the international legal system is not coming to help them. And so another scholar called Dr. China Mieville has explained that on that basis, there's a constant backdrop of violence in international legal relations. Because if you want to bring international law to bear, in many cases that has to involve violence of some kind. So that's quite disheartening, and we may feel tempted to say, well, international law is completely useless and people have absolutely no influence. But I think that's probably being a bit too pessimistic, and that's a point that another scholar called Dr. Rob Knox has written about, and he says that non-state actors, which would be NGOs, social movements, lawyers, whoever it may be, they can sometimes use their powers to turn the content of international law to their own ends. So what that means is we can take advantage of certain opportunities that are there within the international legal system, even though they're limited. So by and large, there's this recognition in the materialist school that there's something inherently wrong about international law, but there are opportunities. But the Twale position, the third worldist position, is a bit different in the sense that it's a bit more optimistic. The Twale school focuses on legal reformism. It tries to start from the position that essentially the legacy of colonialism is very strong in the foundations of international law, and that's something that Professor Anthony Anghie has written about. And so the Twalers would say what we really need to do is try to use all of our influence that we can get together to remove this colonial legacy that exists in international law, because it's that colonial legacy which maintains harmful hierarchies of power. And so I think there are merits in that analysis, although I tend to find the materialist analysis a bit more helpful in understanding why it is, that international law doesn't produce the effects that people, particularly people who believe in the sort of liberal way of thinking, expect it to produce.
Hmm. I also think I also gravitate towards more materialistic point of view, because I think that again it's about the nature of power, and I think we can see it from the global perspective to local level. Like in Pakistan, I think we see a lot of exploitation from the rich to the poor, which includes dispossession of their homes, and all kinds of violence which we see at the global level in a racial form. So I think that the power dynamics is something which is not encapsulated within the language of law, and I think it's always the politics, the power politics that frames the law. If I have the enough leverage in terms of power, I will frame the rules, and then the game will be inherently tilted towards me. So I think we can see this from the national, global, local level, all levels, and I tend to gravitate towards that perspective too. At the end of the day, I think a lot of things have related to the imperial capitalist interests of the United States, and that was also one of the creation of Israel. The reasons for the creation of Israel. So I totally agree with your point of view, and I think this is something which is very, very sad. How material greed has corrupted, I would say, law in its essence. This takes me to my third question. I think we have seen that the International Court of Justice in 2004 advisory opinion have given Palestinians the right to self-determination. And why are Palestinians not able to exercise such right? Because, as a student of international law, I want to learn that although there is an advisory opinion, although International Court of Justice has clearly stated that they have the right to self-determination, they are still not able to exercise such right. And to be very honest, the Western states are not acknowledging this right. Then again, it raises a very big question on international law, don't you think?
I think so, and I think that this is something that where we have to sort of bridge the gap between the theory of power dynamics and then how it plays out in terms of, as you say, the ICJ advisory opinion in 2004. And I will just situate this in a sort of a broader context, because the Palestinian people, of course, one people among several who are longing to exercise their right to self-determination. There's the case of the Chagos Islands, for example, and of course there's the issue of Kashmir, which is often forgotten about in the West, but that's an example of a controlling state like India engaging in brutal repression, numerous human rights violations, clear breaches of international law, but still getting away with it, not being held to account for its crimes. And so there are many other movements for self-determination around the world. So the problems with the right to self-determination aren't unique to Palestine, although I would say that given the scale of barbarity, the crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and also the very long history of oppression of Palestinians, it's often the sort of foremost issue on all of our minds. And I would argue that it's essentially impossible to exercise the right to self-determination without forcing the right to be implemented. And I would say to understand the difficulty in realizing the right to self-determination, it's helpful to perhaps just give a quick case study. And so I would look at the case of Indonesia, because in Indonesia, you've had the case of East Timor and West Papua, which have had self-determination movements. And there are many people in those regions who may not have wanted to be part of Indonesia, but only one of those areas has since become independent of Indonesia, which is East Timor. Right, West Papua is not independent; it's part of Indonesia at the moment. So the question is, why was one area able to exercise self-determination and not the other one? Well, let's look at the material perspective. So if you look at the economic side, East Timor and West Papua both have lots of natural resources. They've got oil and gas reserves. The Grasberg mine in West Papua has the single biggest gold reserve and the second biggest copper reserve in the world. It has huge, liquefied natural gas reserves and oil palms. And in East Timor, oil and gas is huge economically. So basically, both of those regions are very important economically and politically. And lots of international companies are involved in exploiting those natural resources. And the United States and Australia, of course, being very close by to Indonesia, have played huge roles in that. So having these places become independent essentially is an economic and a political problem. And what I'm saying is many interests would be affected through independence. So how did East Timor become independent then? So, well, in both East Timor and West Papua, there have been armed struggles. In East Timor, there was a very long guerrilla warfare campaign against the Indonesian military for many years. But in West Papua, the armed struggle has been quite mild. So in East Timor, where there was a huge armed struggle, obviously there was lots of economic disruption. There were security problems for the Indonesian government, the foreign businesses that operated there. That hasn't really been the case in West Papua. And so when it eventually came to a point in 1998 where Indonesia, which was at that point in time in a period of reform after the fall of Suharto, they agreed to an independence referendum in East Timor. And in the end, both the United States and Australia supported Timorese independence because their business interests were, able to survive that transition. So you could argue that there were three reasons why East Timor became independent. One, because there was a long, concerted armed struggle. It caused significant disruption and political disruption for the Indonesian government and foreign businesses. Two, because two powerful Western states supported East Timor against Indonesia. And three, in the end, Indonesia itself agreed to have an independence referendum. So, in other words, East Timor leveraged a huge amount of economic and political power, whereas West Papua, hasn't been able to do that. So I think that essentially proves the point. International law doesn't work by itself. It's influenced totally by external factors, economic, political, military factors. And so if we apply that to Palestine, I suppose that the reason Palestinians haven't been able to exercise the right to self-determination is because they haven't yet been able to leverage the economic, political, military power that they need to force Israel to accede to its demands, or indeed if they wish to defeat the state of Israel entirely. And so we should realize that the state of Israel is strategically vital for pushing Western interests in the region, for destabilizing West Asian countries and so on. And there's also a proposal to create a new canal called the Ben Gurion Canal through the south of Palestine, which would rival the Suez Canal, which of course is a huge artery for international commerce, and that would be economically hugely important. So again, there are so many interests working against Palestinians. So it doesn't really matter if the International Court of Justice says, yes, well, Palestinians have a right to self-determination, because the only way they'll be able to truly exercise that right, I think, and if we look at it from a materialist point of view, is if they're able to leverage the power to force that right to be upheld.
Hmm. Very interesting. One follow-up question on East Timor. So the Western um, countries wanted a very peaceful environment for their companies to thrive. That is why they were very, very interested in getting East Timor independent. That was the main reason, right?
Well, it was certainly one of the contributing factors. I mean, there was international treaty between Australia and Indonesia called the Timor Gap Treaty, which allows sort of Australia to exploit natural resources in that region. And interestingly, the Timor Gap Treaty was able to survive the transition to an independent East Timor. So I think the fact that it seemed to be the case that their Western economic interests were going to be able to survive this transition, and actually they'd have a stable economy to work in, was, I think, helpful in promoting Timorese independence. Certainly, it was certainly one of the huge contributing factors.
So what we are seeing basically, to be very honest, is that if Western economies and Western countries have economic interest in a particular region, suddenly the international law molds, becomes more effective, becomes more efficient in implementation, becomes more enforceable. So this is what you are saying, basically, right?
Essentially, yes.
All right, all right. Well, that's so pessimistic if you are working in international law. But I think let's be a little optimistic. Do you think that within international law there is any capacity, the current international legal framework, which is more, positivist in nature? Do you think that in the current international legal framework, there is any hope for the Palestinians to have any kind of resolution, any kind of remedy for them? Because, or do you think that the current international law has any capacity to work for the third world? Because if we see, there are General Assembly resolutions which provide Palestinians the right to self-determination and to get it through all means, including armed struggle, because a lot of international lawyers say that Palestine and Gaza Strip, particularly, is under occupation. And since it's under occupation, Palestinians can have the right to get their freedom through armed struggle. And then international humanitarian law also puts a lot of obligations on Israel not to, kill civilians and many other, not to starve the population and many other obligations. Similarly, international criminal law, also provides a way for the Palestinians in terms of their remedy because they have the jurisdiction because Palestine has ratified the Rome Statute. So do you think that, if we look at international humanitarian law, international human rights law, international criminal law, public international law, at least theoretically, it does provide a certain remedy for the Palestinians. So do you think that maybe that current international law has any hope for the Palestinians in terms of remedy?
I mean, I certainly think that there is. I mean, there's certainly a lot that can be done within the framework of international law to support Palestine. Although, of course, it is limited, but just because it's limited, it doesn't mean that we should just abandon it altogether, because it does have its uses. In the end, what I think is needed is a multi-pronged strategy. So, for example, as you mentioned very eloquently, the people of Palestine have the right to resist an occupying power, including by force of arms. That's a point that, it should be stressed, despite the fact that it's often, an unpopular argument to make, particularly in Western countries. But, that is something that the Palestinian people have the right to do. Additionally, while the analysis only takes you so far, the fact that many human rights NGOs, international human rights NGOs like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, have said that Israel is committing a crime against humanity through its apartheid practices. That's helped to, pressure the state of Israel. It's also helped to ruin its public image. And it's helped to also provide a shield to pro-Palestine campaigners who are sometimes accused of being anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, because they call Israel an apartheid state. And it's given them a tool in their arsenal to assist in the cause of Palestinian liberation. And yes, I mean, the fact that the International Court of Justice has said that Palestinians have a right to self-determination is helpful in a sense, because all of these things are coming together to create a sort of critical mass, right? Eventually, in that situation, Palestinians will be able to leverage the power they need to exercise their rights, I think. So we should use the space that's there, every space, whether it's in the media, whether it's in international law, wherever it is. And as people who are involved in the legal sector, we should be pushing for that. And also academics, scholars, judges, and so on. Everyone has their role to play. And so all of these avenues are very helpful. And Dr. Rob Knox, who I mentioned earlier, has called this principled opportunism. So what he's saying is that international law is consciously used just as a tool. It's a tool. We have no illusions about what it is, but we can use it as a tool that's helpful for us. And that's similar to something that the Soviet scholar Evgeny Pashikanis was advocating as well, because he said that law, and by extension, international law,
Yeah.
is inherently flawed. It's based in capitalism, it's based in imperialism. But at the moment, we're in this period where we're trying to hopefully transition away from that kind of unjust system which exploits, the great majority of people across the entire world. And so, in the meantime, we should absolutely take advantage of any avenue that assists us in pushing just causes. So I do believe we should engage with the international legal system, and everyone should take advantage as well of the idea of human rights as tools in a diverse strategy, and it has to be a diverse strategy. It's only one tool that across many things that we should be doing to achieve a better standard of living and achieving emancipation and also liberation. And as I say, we should do that without any illusions, because there are many limitations. But as long as we understand what the limitations are, I don't think there's any harm in operating in that sphere, because it's a very important area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think basically at the end of the day, I also agree that international law is a tool, like all laws. And if we get power, we can frame rules and we can frame laws. And until and unless we don't have that in the third world, at least what we can do is to get inside this framework, understand the tool, give our input, so that as the tool is evolving, we also have some input so that it doesn't evolve totally without our input. And that is why I think capacity building in countries like Pakistan is very important, so that we understand what is this tool, because it has been used against us. So if you really want to fight it, you really want to understand this tool. And it's a very, very, I would say, Western dominated field, international law generally. There's the last question that I want to ask you, and it is more, I would say, political question than a legal question. My understanding that, I'm seeing a lot of protests all over the world, in the West, in the East, everywhere. And I'm also seeing boycotting movements of capital, big companies like Siemens and Western companies. So, do you think that, and also one more thing, that we have seen that the hypocrisy of the Western institutions like CNN, you know, and other institutions. Academia, Western academia. I read recently that a Berkeley law professor is asking law firms not to hire his students because they said they supported Palestine, and he said that, or they're anti-Semitic. So, do you think that? I think for hypocrisy of the Western academia, the Western media institutions, is very, very evident. I think the people who were the most apologists can now see it. So do you think it will counter this idea of prestige economy? The Muslim youth are the youth in global South, generally in Africa and India and everywhere. They are very, very impressed by the Western social capital. Do you think it might damage it a little, this whole hypocrisy that is so evident now? Or do you think it is not? Economic interests are still in the West, so um, you know, they will not care much. Do you think the conscience of the Muslim youth or the youth in global South can be impacted by such evident hypocrisy that is so now manifested?
Well, I mean, I struggle to answer in some respects, because I'm obviously based here in Britain, and so I'm not exposed in depth to the opinions and of people in the global South. But what I would say from my perspective is that yes, the hypocrisy is absolutely nauseatingly clear, and anyone here in Britain, in the West, can see it palpably. I mean, the scale of propaganda, disinformation, and smears and defamation is just incredible. I mean, and it's triggered a huge backlash and an awakening here in Britain, where people are understanding that the state is acting incredibly improperly in trying to suppress them. So, in London, for example, there have been weekly protests every single Saturday with huge turnouts, ever increasing turnouts. The most recent one had 500,000 people. And we're in a situation where the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, was putting huge pressure on the Metropolitan Police in London to cancel the demonstration. I mean, this is a country that supposedly is based on, you know, human rights and the right to freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, telling over 500,000 of its citizens, if you want to lawfully and peacefully protest, you can't do that. We're going to actually try to ban you from doing that. And so I think, just as what happened with Iraq and with Afghanistan and these unlawful wars that were launched on the basis of false pretexts, and which I think triggered a deep amount of resentment against Western countries, I think this will do the same. But unfortunately, there are many people, from what I can see in many global South countries, who are West toxified. I would use that term, West toxified. And so they have this illusion about what the West is, this place with freedom and democracy. And of course, there are comforts in the West, and there are many privileges and benefits of living in a Western country. I won't deny that. But at the same time, the scale of political freedom and also so many social issues are so poor now that I think people who do think that, you know, the West, which is now in perpetual decline, is somehow going to save them and offer them the future, they need to reconsider. In fact, many people in Britain are considering moving out of Britain. I mean, there are people, not even just the descendants of immigrants, but native or indigenous Britons, if such a thing exists, wanting to move over to the United Arab Emirates or Qatar or wherever it is, because they don't see a future in Britain. So I think that this Westoxification is a problem, but it's based in an illusion and a fantasy about what these countries really are. And they claim, as we know, to be based on human rights and freedom and liberty and democracy. But when anything really comes and threatens that in any kind of real way, you then see the true authoritarianism that lurks under the surface coming out.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. And I think I personally know people native Britain who have moved out of Britain. So I do agree that this West, as you said, West toxification in the youth of the global South needs to end. But I also think that as long as the dollar dominates the world, and this exchange rate, all this exchange rate play game exists, it will be beneficial, and the flow will always be from the south to the north. And even if you don't want to, people will go because there are very, very harsh economic realities in global south that can be solved by becoming an immigrant and going to Western countries. So as long as the economic structure, economic matrix, as you said, remains, I think it will be very difficult. Even if you get out of this West toxification, the pragmatic reality will force you to go towards West. Um, with that, I am really thankful, Ammar, for coming to our podcast. It was a wonderful conversation. I enjoyed it, and I always learn from you. And I know that you have been busy in organizing campaigns and protests on this Palestine issue. And I hope that you can strengthen your resolve and in combating this kind of injustice. So I'm really thankful that you have become our guest, and I hope our viewers will also enjoy our conversation and find that very insightful.
Thank you very much, Shahzeb. As I said, it was a pleasure, and I'm very grateful for the invitation and for you listening to me. And if anything I can do to assist, I'm always happy to speak to anyone. I'm always available, despite sometimes the stresses in this particular juncture, as you say, with the situation in Palestine that's happening. But we move forward and we continue, and we're working at the end of the day for a just cause and a better world. So I think we have that on our side.